Hello everybody, welcome back to BareRose Garage. What are we going to talk about today? Well, let's talk about the difficulties of hot rodding and modifying with Ford. That's right, Ford Motor Company, one of America's oldest family-owned business. That's right, to this day, a Ford still owns Ford. You can't say that about any of the other companies, so let's deep dive into the blue oval and see exactly what it is that makes Ford, in my opinion, the hardest of all of them to play with. Let's take a look. Okay, you can see here, I'm leveling off of my carburetors. Now that is a primary, ultimate important thing that you can do, especially with these Hollies right here. And the reason for that is a Holly runs their float bowls front and rear. So the best way to get these things dialed in perfect so they run within their parameters is to try to keep them as level as possible. Now you don't have to go to the exact 100% degree, but just try your hardest to make sure that they're level. And right now, well, if I zoomed in here, I'm right in between the bubble. That's plenty good enough for me. But you'll notice here I've got another level down on the valve cover. Now the reason I put it on the valve cover is because I can't put it on the crankshaft, but this is as close as I can get to the crankshaft to show you exactly what's going on when you're playing with Ford. And this is something that very few people talk about. I've thrown my level down here on the valve cover, and you can clearly see there, it's just touching this forward bubble. Now I come up here to my air cleaners and my carburetor base, and I'm dead nuts on right there. Well, close enough for me. It's in between the lines on the level. So those carburetors will work good there, but the valve covers are actually almost the same. Now what does that mean? Inside the car, that comes all the way out to my yoke angle right there. That all follows the angle that's on that valve cover that I just showed you. Now my first vision for this car was to do a street freak gasser look with the nose up in the air a little bit, lift it up, and that engine, I'm trying to make the engine look bigger than what it actually is. If you really want to know, I'm kind of going for, got a little Hot Wheels example here, I'm kind of going for this kind of look. Now, my first intentions with it, with the air cleaner sticking way up there like that, making the engine look really big, was to go like this, about like that. And, you know, with the straight axle front end, just the mean, old 70s, 60s street freak gasser look. Now, if I was playing with Chevy, that's exactly what I'd be doing. Why? Because a Chevy is exact opposite of a Ford. On a Ford though, when I stuck that front end of this car right here up there like that, the yoke at the end of the transmission was way up in the car, and I got to looking at it and I measured down to the rear end. Yeah, that driveline angle was super steep. Now the last thing I want to happen with this car, doing a burnout or anything like that, is to have it dead hook, snap that U-joint right at the tail shaft of the transmission there, and have that driveline come in and give me a big old monkey bump on the side of the knee. So the only way I could fix that, because it's a Ford, is I had to lift the ass of the car and sink the nose. Now by doing it that way, when I set the car instead of this way, I set it this way, what I'm actually doing is I'm alleviating the driveline angle by lifting the car up in the rear end instead of going the other way. Fords, if you'll notice on a lot of old Fords, when you open the hood of an old car, like that Mercury is a good prime example, or any of the first gen, pretty much all the way through, Mustangs. When you open the hood on them, on a Ford, the engine sets down a little. Open the hood on a Camaro. You open that up, the engine sets up higher a little bit. Why? Because on a Chevy, they got it right. That angle that I'm talking about right there, the crank angle, is perfect on a Chevy because they put the oil pan, the oil sump, where it needs to be, in the back of the engine. Why does it need to be in the back of the engine? Well, Newton's law. That's pretty simple. An object that's at rest stays at rest until acted upon by another force. Yeah, everybody knows that rule. Duh, we learned that a long time ago. Well, what happens when you step on the gas on a Chevy? Doesn't matter. All the oil's in the back anyway. As the engine is oiling, what happens? It all runs to the back and straight back down, gets back there quick and drains back quick. So you'll always have oil when in a Chevy, no matter how you set them. And because of that driveline angle, or the crank to tail shaft angle, you can put that engine anywhere you want. You can go high, you can go low, anything you want. It's inherently built into the design to be super strong no matter where you put it, no matter what your car angle is. A Chevy will work, and a Chevy will always oil. Ford, you don't have that luxury. Especially in this one where I'm using the front sump. And in my opinion, with a Ford, the front sump is the best of the bunch. And I'll show you why. Okay, right here I've got my actual motor. I've got the tunnel ram off of it because I'm using it for the mock-up in the other one. But it's a perfect time I could show you exactly why I prefer the worst of the bunch of the Ford oil pan designs, but what makes it actually the best one. Now, everybody knows on the Ford distributor up front, right? Everybody says, well, at least Ford got something right. They put the distributor in the right place. It's actually totally 200% wrong. The distributor needs in the back because that's where your oil pump is. You follow that all the way down because your oil pump runs off of your distributor drive, and it picks it up off of the cam here, and it all follows in a line down in here. And on the front sump Ford, the oil pump sits right down in here in this happy little zone that's filled clear up here with oil. Now what it does is it comes down inside of the oil here, and it's got a little itty bitty little pickup tube that goes like this to the pickup screen. And that pickup screen sits down in here. So it's almost always covered in oil. But yeah, you guessed it, because of Newton's law and this sump being in the front, as soon as you give her the beans and step on her good and hard, that oil tries to go over here to the back where it can't be. And as it's doing that, and it's trying to drain back through this shallow area here where the crank is, it's actually picking up oil, and you're getting what's called windage. On a Ford, they have a lot of windage. Chrysler does too, but I'm not going to get into Chrysler. You guys know what you got with the mid-sump. But on a Ford, we're dealing with the same issues as you guys, but it's actually made to have windage. Now in racing, everybody talks, oh, windage, oh, get rid of it. You don't want windage. That robs horsepower and everything. I'll tell you right now, you need windage. You got to have a little bit of that sling, okay? Not necessarily windage, but you want the sling to happen. Now what's going on is that oil is, as it's coming down and draining back through your oil pan, and all of the violent things that are going inside your engine block here, as that's going on, your crank, your rods, everything that's spinning in there is flinging oil around. And what it's doing, okay, these are the top ones, but I can get you a good idea here. What it's doing is it's keeping these open cam lobes happy oiled. As the oil is slinging around in there, it's getting on these cam lobes, all the exterior exposed stuff. And it's got the holes here, so as the oil is flinging out here, it's coming in on all your lifters and just keeping the tops of your lifters happy, along with the pressurized oil that's going through and keeping oil pressure on your cam lobes and your cam bearings, sorry, not cam lobes. It's keeping your cam bearings pressurized, your rod bearing's pressurized, and your main bearing's pressurized. Now that's what oil pressure does. Oil pressure keeps all of them happy and pressurized because your camshaft, your crankshaft, and your rods all actually float inside of there. I know it sounds really weird, right? But the best way to reduce friction is to make things float as they're doing it. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're in there floating on a very thin layer of pressurized oil. That's where your oil pressure is needed. Everything else that I just said there is external oiling, the splash around oiling. You have to have that too to keep the outside surfaces all nice and happy. Now what happens when you lose a little bit of oil pressure is those bearings, like your rods, your mains, and your cam, what'll happen is they'll lose a little pressure and they'll strike the side of the bearing. Actually, they're not bearings like you would think of about other bearings. They're not needle bearings, they're not ball bearings. What they actually are is they're holding the oil pressure to there. The bearing that you think of is actually the oil pressure. So when they lose a little of that oil pressure, like I said, they'll strike the bearing. And when they do that, you see a little copper wearing because they're copper underneath and they're covered in a babbitt material. Yeah, it's a mixture of lead and other metallurgy that I'm not even going to talk about on here. But it's got a thin layer of a sacrificial metal, so when if things go bad, the little bit of contact will come in. That's what happens when you lose oil pressure or you dip in oil pressure. It allows them rotating parts to come into contact with the bearing, even though the bearing that you're actually thinking of is actually oil pressure. So what does this translate to with Ford, and why Ford is the hardest of the bunch to get this right, and why you want to be very, very careful messing with Ford? Now, when you heard me talking about this and why I prefer the front sump over all the other sumps has to do with the pickup tube and where it's located inside of the sump here. As I said on this one, it's always buried in oil until you nail it good and hard, and then all the oil comes away. And what happens when the oil comes away? Your pickup tube will pick up air. Now let's go and show you what Ford tried to do to try to fix this problem with what is called the dual sump, or as Ford guys will say, oh, a rear sump, but it's actually a dual sump. Let's go over and take a look at it. Get back to the meat and taters of what's going on here. All right, you got the drive shaft coming down here off of the crank, down into this happy little zone where the oil pump lives. And it's going to be covered in oil like this, keeping your oil pump nice and happy and lubed. Now what goes on from there is you got your big pickup tube that comes up and follows the bottom of this pan and goes down here to the pickup screen that hides right about here. So it's always buried in oil. Now this sounds like a good design, right? It sounds like a good fix, and how Ford was able to get around and actually upgrade their oiling system. Well, there's an extreme problem with this system. What'll happen is your oil, when the car sits, slowly drains back out. What happens when that drains back out? You get an air pocket in there and your pickup tube as it drains back into the oil here. When you go out and you fire it up for the first time, well, after it's sat all day, or you've gone to Walmart and done a little shopping and everything, come out and got back in your car and fired it up, you got an air bubble here that'll sit up here in the air tube, in the pickup tube. It's kind of like when you get air in your brakes. What happens when you get a little air in your brakes? The pedal goes to the floor, or it's spongy. That's exactly what's going on now in this Ford now. You get that air bubble in there and you lose oil pressure. You have no oil pressure. Now that goes back to what I was just talking about there. Oil is actually your main bearing, rod bearing, and cam bearing bearings. If it loses pressure, you got no bearings there, and they come into contact with the babbitt material that's on the bearings that they call. And worse yet, as this air comes up and goes through the oil pump that's right here, what an oil pump is, it's basically a set of gears like this. And what it does is it grabs the oil here and compresses it into them gear cogs and pushes it out the other end in pressurized form. Very simple pump that works very, very well. But as that air goes through there and it compresses through those cogs, if you want to call them, and it shoots it out through, what your oil pump turns into is a carburetor. And it carbonates your oil. And by that I mean it sends little tiny air bubbles all through your oiling system. So basically what's going on is you go from, let's just say, 50 weight oil to 0 weight oil, and your oil pressure takes a dive. And it takes a dive in its most crucial time, the first startup. First startup is when it has to have good oil pressure. You notice in a Ford, when you first start them up, the oil pressure goes and then takes off. Now on a Chevy, it's the exact opposite. When you hit that starter on a Chevy and she fires, that oil pressure goes boom and it shoots right up. Because a Chevy always has the pickup tube, and a little bitty pickup tube, not a 5-mile long one, that goes up and down and back over. On a Chevy, just like on the front sump of a Ford, they're little itty bitty, constantly covered in oil, so there's never a chance, well, not usually a chance for your oil pump to become a carburetor and lose all your oil pressure. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I see people make with these Fords, and especially in FE, and the Windsors, a lot of people make this mistake on a Windsor, is they'll notice they don't run very good oil pressure. Well, I just explained why they don't run very good oil pressure, but to combat that, what they'll do is they'll put a high volume or a high pressure oil pump in them, trying to get them up to Chevy standards or Mopar standards. Mopar had it right too, but they'll try to shoot for those kind of oil pressure numbers when actually the problem is the pickup tube is too long and it goes up and down like that. So it's always draining back, and you've got air in your lines, in your oil lines, losing that oil pressure. So all you're doing if you put a high volume pump on them is you're sending all your oil to the top of the engine. Well, what's the problem with that? What, doesn't it drain back? Well, here we go. We'll talk about the king of the kings. What happens when a Chevy sends all of its oil up to the top? Well, it doesn't matter quite as bad, because on a Chevy, you can see this is pretty close to carb level here. I know you can't see the level too good. You have to take my word for it. It's pretty close to level there. I come down here and I measure across, and you can see a Chevy is tipped way back. On a Chevy, when it sends the oil up to the top, because of that angle, the crank angle that actually makes the Chevy and GM weaker rear ends, weaker tail shaft transmissions, super strong, because that angle is making everything stronger than what it is, should be, is also draining the oil back to that rear sump where it needs to be. A Chevy will always oil, no matter what. Well, unless you turn them upside down, but you get the idea. They're already designed to get the oil back. Now on this big block Ford here, you can see it's level, so it takes time for it to drop the oil back down into the oil pan to be picked back up to send back through the system. So if you put a high volume oil pump on a Ford or a high pressure pump on a Ford, two things will happen. One, you'll be busting drive shafts, distributor drive shafts, like no tomorrow. It puts so much resistance on that little shaft that especially when you start running racing oils and stuff like that, that's a higher, thicker oil, yeah, you'll snap them shafts all the time. You'll strip out distributors, the bottom of the distributor where the shaft goes in, it'll just spin those right out. That's one problem. Number two is you'll stuff all the oil up to the top. It can't drain back fast enough. You'll starve it. You'll lose oil pressure, and you'll take rod bearings, main bearings, and camshafts. And it's all because they didn't follow this crank angle like GM started. Like I said, Mopar, you guys picked up on it too, and you guys are rocking and rolling with it. Ford, on the other hand, they kept their engine, their crank angles and everything pretty much level, making it hard for the oil to get back into the pan, especially in time for it to pick up on the oil. On a Ford, I never go with a high volume or a high pressure oil pump. I always stay within stock parameters with that, just because I want to be able to get that oil back down in time so I don't turn my oil pump into a carburetor. So what does that all mean on how that's all dictating on how my car is going to be built, my stance and everything? Why am I following all of that to get this car, instead of making it into the gasser look, why am I going more for the stink bug look? Well, as I told you in the beginning, it's to keep that driveline, the crankshaft to tail shaft to transmission angle all in line with my rear end. So it'll all make it very happy and very dependable and very strong. Now, one of the things that I was fighting it. I was trying real hard to get this nose up in the air and to do the gasser look. And my dad brought up a good point about put a Windish tray on it and just tip these back and sidewind these when you mount these carburetors sideways. So then with the Hollies, if they're mounted forward like this, you really want to make sure they're level. Hollies don't like this, and they don't like that. If they sit up like this, what'll happen is you'll starve your primaries and you'll flood, you'll have more in your secondaries. If it goes the other way, the exact opposite happens. The way to kind of get around doing that is to mount these sideways, like an Edelbrock, because that's the way Edelbrocks are. Edelbrocks and Carters and all those, their float bowls are on the sides. That's why an Edelbrock doesn't really matter if it goes up and down. A lot of four-wheel drive guys will not run a Holly because of that. You start climbing up a good-sized hill, and a Holly, they do all kinds of weird things. Your primaries lean right way out. They run out of gas is what happens, because your float goes blink, pings out, and stops it so it can't get no more fuel, and then your secondaries have got way too much fuel in them, and they run like crap in an off-road situation. Edelbrocks don't, because they're mounted on the side, so when you tip them up and tip them down, they're not as affected. But anyway, skip to the end on that. I don't want the look of these being out of level. I want my air cleaners, I want my carburetors, I want everything level. And I want to bring that engine up to where my main goal is to be able to read that wind across the hood. I want that up above because I'm going for that cartoony street freak, but instead of going up in the air, I'm going to go stink bug like this. I'm using the car to adjust the car body to adjust my pinion and transmission angle. The more I raise the rear up, the more I take away that angle. Perfect. Anyways, So that's the reason I'm going with that. My dad, he really wants me to do the gasser look. He wants the nose up look. He told me to put a Windish tray in it. Now what a Windish tray does is it goes in there and it mounts across your main caps usually and sticks some good heavy baffles into the oil pan. Well, that's fine and dandy for a car that just runs a quarter mile. For all you guys that are into race cars and all that, you know, Windish trays, they're perfect because those cars only run for what? Half mile? Maybe? Quarter mile? They spend 1/8 of a mile up and then they idle 1/8 of a mile back. Or they launch and they go for a quarter mile and they idle a quarter mile back. And then they shut off and they're done, right? That little bit of drive time, or even a car that you're only going to drive every once in a while, a Windish tray is okay. But what a Windish tray also does, it stops that splash. And on a Ford, you need that splash. And especially with a flat tappet cam. The splash that's going on in there that the Windish tray stops is actually what goes up and keeps the tops of your cam lobes nice and happy and oiled and everything. It's got to be able to fling some of that up there to keep that all happy. I think that's part of the reason people are having cam problems. A lot of those guys have got Windish trays in there. Those Windish trays, they're stopping that. So you're starving your cam lobes of the splash oil that the engine is actually designed to do. You'll notice Windish trays really didn't become a thing in stock cars, from the factory cars, until they started coming out with roller cams, because a roller cam doesn't need it quite as bad as these flat tappets. So when they started getting into the roller cams, you started seeing Windish trays. Why? Because they're not flat tappet cams. If you're running a flat tappet and you want to drive it, you're going to be holding it at constant RPM for a good hour, 2 hours. You want that a little bit of that windage going on, flinging that oil up and around and keeping your rods and your cam lobes and all of that stuff happy oiled with the fling. So I want that fling. I don't want a Windish tray in here. That's all stuff you have to think about when you're building a car for the purpose you want to build it for. This car is going to be driven. It's not going to be just trailered around to events. I plan on driving it for taking it out on 2-3 hour road trips, when I can afford the fuel for it. It's not going to be just a strictly one-trick pony. And to keep it as versatile like that, I don't want a Windish tray in it. If there's no Windish tray in it, and I don't really want to put a heavy baffled oil pan in it, because the heavier the baffle to the oil pan is, the more it takes to get the oil back into the sump, because it's up front. The drain back, it takes longer for the drain back to fill up. So I got to play with my stock parameters and still make this big block Ford get this 58 down the road or into the burnout pits of every event that I go to. So I hope that kind of explains it a little bit there on what, in my opinion, makes Ford, the Blue Oval, the most challenging of all of the big three. And by the big three, I mean Mopar, GM, you get the idea. And why Chevy rules king of the roost in all of this stuff. Because of that crankshaft angle, you can put a Chevy engine anywhere you want to put it. That's probably why they put a small block Chevy in everything, because it's just easy. When you play with Ford, because of that, you really got to pay attention and you really have to know what you're doing. Otherwise, bad things are going to happen. And more importantly, the ghost of Henry Ford will reach up out of the grave, grab a hold of your wallet, and suck about 6 bennies out every time. I've seen it happen. So I hope that covers it up there a little bit for you. And in the meantime, get out there and get the metal hot. And we'll keep these old girls on the road where they belong. We'll catch you on the next one.